Hey everyone, this is the Innovator's Mindset with Eric Bosarge. Here we go, man. I am so blessed. I actually met Eric. He is a high school English teacher, amongst other things, at the Brunswick Schools in Brunswick, Maine. I was there, and I want to give a little. I was there, it was my last speaking event. I want to give everyone in Brunswick Schools a little, shout out. So you didn't know I had that, did you, Eric? Right? You didn't think it was
Kind of
started.
anticipated that though, yeah.
No, I was actually in Brunswick, Maine at the end of August, and I did their school opening, and it was legitimately one of the most amazing, kind, welcoming groups, and I felt really blessed to be there. And it was a long road for the summer, and I hadn't been with my family. You just could have made me feel so welcome. And Eric, actually, just a little side story before I turn it over to Eric. Eric came up to me during the break, and he basically talked about some of the stuff I was talking about. And he said, "I like, could I be on your podcast?" I'm like, "Absolutely." And so, like, anytime if someone is listening there, if you're in an audience, come up to me. Yeah, like I love having teachers on the podcast, hearing about, and he's got something that he's doing in the classroom that I know he wants to share, and I'm really interested in learning more about. So, Eric, if you can just tell everyone who you are, what you do today, and how you got there, I think it's a great place to start.
Okay, yeah, thank you for having me on your
My
show. First of
pleasure.
all, I appreciate it. And you got rave reviews on, essentially opening day at the district. It was sparked a lot of really good conversations. So we were really happy to have you. It wasn't just you. So my name's Eric. I'm a high school English teacher. My story and like the way I got there is a little bit unique because I dropped out of high school and I never really liked English classes to begin with, but yet I went on. I initially was in healthcare and I wanted to help people, and then I fell in love with writing, which was like a long dormant passion. And I changed my major to English. I got a master's in creative writing, published a couple books, and I started teaching at the college level. And as soon as I started doing that, I started teaching college writing. I realized how much I liked writing and how my passion for helping people and for actually writing and reading and all that stuff came together. And it wasn't long before I started teaching high school as soon as I had fulfilled the student teaching requirements. And I've been doing it ever since, and I really like it. My goal is always to be like the teacher I never had that is welcoming and warm and sees people at where they're at and makes English more worthwhile than it was for me, at least in my high school experience.
Like when you're talking about this, it's really interesting because I know that sounds weird. I loved my English teachers. I really, I could tell you, Herman Bauer, Burrow Bauer, they were amazingly kind, welcoming. But
Yep.
I also I didn't really like writing. I didn't really like it was, I remember them. They were great people, but I don't necessarily, I didn't love writing. It took me a long, long time to actually get into writing. I didn't start really, I know this sounds weird. I didn't really start reading until my 30s. And then
Okay.
I started writing later. So I'm really fascinated about this. And so like why do you think, maybe you didn't really like writing in high school when you were a student? Like what was maybe the disconnect for you at that time?
I think the disconnect for me was that I didn't really see the purpose in reading a book and then writing about it
Hmm.
because it just seemed like it was constantly like, okay, so you've got to come up with a thesis. And I'm like, well, what do I have to say? Like, and it's almost like there was not enough critical thinking pieces
Yeah.
that were onboarded first for me to say, oh, this is what you want. Like, here's a graphic organizer, here's your key points. And it was almost just like, what's the point? I didn't really even like this book anyway. I thought it was boring. You know what I mean? The other thing about like the more traditional methods of teaching that I had, and if any of my former teachers are out there listening, I hope they're not upset by this in any way, shape, or form. I definitely had some other stuff going on in high school as well, but if you're the kind of student who struggles to even get to school because you've got some other stuff going on, and you show up to class, and the first thing you get through the door is a reading quiz on a book that one you didn't like to begin with, and it's not about something that you want to read about, or it's something that causes you to think about other stuff you don't want to think about. You've already kind of been beaten down to begin with. You know what I mean? And it's almost like this punitive thing, like you're not thinking right, you're not getting it. And it just seemed like such a negative environment.
Mhm.
And for somebody like me, I remember like going home on the almost the first week of freshman English and reading Siddhartha and being like, okay, so I read the whole thing. And then we go back to class. And I didn't like it anyway, because there was some religious stuff going on in my background. But we're going to talk about this one chapter at a time. We're going to kill this book with reading quizzes and go really slow. It just wasn't going to work for me at all.
You know,
So,
You know, when you're talking about this, the one of the things I talked about with your group is that there is a pendulum I'm trying to work on, is that how do you actually really tap into passions and interests of kids in your classrooms? And the example I always bring up Great Gatsby because I know most schools read it. And
Yeah.
you know, I ask that question, and people get a little like some people get really mad at me for bringing it up. Like, how dare you question teaching? And I'm not saying don't. And again, if you're listening to podcasts, I'm not saying don't teach Great Gatsby, but I would have been really interested in the Jordan rules. I'm a huge basketball fan, Michael Jordan. That was something for me. And I think, you know, kind of as I'm listening to you, one of the things that's interesting for me is that I started reading more based on my interests and, you
Yes.
know, basketball, things like that later. And then weirdly enough, many of the high school, the novels I didn't want to read, I actually then developed an interest in reading. And I think the thing that I always challenge people is like, if you can really get a kid passionate about reading, then
Mhm.
that's a more of an opportunity to expose them things they might not know they're interested in. And I think that's kind of what happened to me after the fact, is that same as you, when you said, like, I always looked at reading as a punishment, right? Like, read this thing that you'll hate.
At
And
least in
so,
the academic
you know,
setting, I got to be honest, I loved reading ever since I was a young child. But it was
right,
when somebody gave me a book and they didn't tell me what the purpose was or what I was
right,
supposed to get out of it, and just here's a bunch of questions. And by the way, did you
right,
forget the color of the character's socks? It's
right.
like
Yeah.
that's not helpful to me. It's
Yeah.
not going to be
Yeah, and that whole like that's something I believe. Like, you have a lot of kids who walk out of school who can read, they just don't want to again, and that we don't want to kill that love of reading. And
yeah,
one of the things
exactly.
that you know, I'm very passionate about, and I think this is like, you embody this, but a lot of people wouldn't necessarily see that unless I make the explicit connection, because my whole focus in my work for probably over a decade has been on innovation. And it's really
Mhm.
looking at doing things in new and better ways. But a lot of people connect it to technology. And I'm like, no, no, no. It's like rethinking professional learning. It's rethinking about how things we do in our classrooms. And so you're still, and it's kind of like you're giving me an iteration of this. This is not like a final product, but you're like, hey, I want to like try this and trying to figure out. And when I asked you at the beginning, like, what would you call this right now? You called it critical lens learning. So tell me like a little bit about that process, what that looks like in a classroom, and how you currently use it.
Okay, so it is new. I started to develop it at the beginning or the end of last year, and the implementation for the first iteration is definitely starting right now, and the school year is young. So that's gotta just say that first. The way this kind of came to be is when I got to college and I changed my major to English. And of course, it was the focus was on writing. But I realized as I was exposed to all the different critical lenses that people in literary theory use, the most maligned of which is like critical lens theory, but there's archetypal structurist, gender and queer theory. There's all these different lenses in which you can view a piece of literature. And all of a sudden, when you do that, things become much more noticeable. If you go back to the Gatsby example, if you
Hmm.
start looking at the role of women in that book, it becomes really interesting. But the problem is, a lot of the times when teachers are teaching that book, and they might even be hitting that same note, the students aren't the ones who are actually taking the perspective to look at that.
Right.
Lots of times it's the teacher saying, hey, let's talk about this. Let's ask this one question about this one quote. What does
Hmm.
it really reveal about this? The goal of this is really to put the students in like the explorer mode of like that book, The Disengaged Teen I was telling you
Right.
about a minute ago, where they're actually the ones in the driver's seat. It's empowering for them to be like, oh, wait, not only do I know how to play the game and what I'm looking for if I ask the right
Right.
questions, but you've given me the option to take that perspective.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
So like when you're talking about this, that your the critical lens learning is like getting the student to go, for example, and I'm trying to like clarify it in my head, to go from the example of a character from experience. Like, give me more of an example of that, and maybe even from I was gonna say from the perspective of the Great Gatsby, but I don't know any of that. I can't remember any of that book. So actually, what do you know? What's funny? One of your teachers actually gave me the Great Gatsby, by the way.
Seriously.
Yeah, totally. When I walked out there, she's like, "Hey, I got a gift for you," and she gave me a copy of The Great Gatsby. Even though she's like, read it again." So, to her listening right now, I have it. I will read it, but I typically read on a plane. I haven't been on a plane since I actually
Okay.
left that day. So
Okay. That's hilarious.
it
I
is
think I
amazing. Yeah.
talked about, I'm definitely going to mention that in passing. Okay, hold on, let me reset. Okay, so the other way that this whole idea came to be is I have a friend who is not a teacher who
Right.
asked me, after many conversations, he's the kind of intellectualist that we can have conversations without ego, so we can just go and go and go and
Yeah.
talk about ideas, and we're like, let's really interrogate this stuff. And at one point, he's like, wait, how do I without going back to college, how do I make my brain work like yours? Because it's really
Right.
interesting. You seem to shift around a lot.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about like a book like The Great Gatsby, you can talk about all kinds of stuff. If you look at, I'm holding the board in front of me. You can put it
Yeah.
up on a screenshot if you have it. But let's take a psychological lens and just look at Gatsby's motivations. If
Mm,
you start looking at that and you start looking at the id, ego, and the superego, you're all of a sudden you're looking at a whole bunch of different behaviors.
right.
And some of those behaviors are incredibly useful for students to name.
Yeah.
Some of those things that he's doing for ego boosting behaviors, for like being driven to go and get his love interest, that kind of stuff is actually useful to students in their own right to recognize that kind of behavior. So I
Right.
started not only thinking of, okay, so you've got historical lens, you've got critical race lens, you've got reader response and Marxist and new historicist, you've got all these different lenses on this board.
Mhm.
I give them a physical lens, and I'll try to show this. I've been trying to give them like a magnifying glass that actually makes things bigger, so that differentiates it, and then they can actually change their perspective. The text stays the exact same,
Mm.
but now I'm giving them the tools that I, as an English teacher, have to make meaning of a text.
Mhm.
When I used to run a publishing company, one of the things we did was we would review books by authors that were similar to the ones that we were publishing and review them. And then obviously we gained their audience, and that was a whole strategy behind that. But if I was ever stuck and I'm like, man, I really don't have anything but a plot summary to say about this, I would go back to this and say, huh, what does it say about power and the structure of the economy in this world building
Mm.
sci-fi novel? And all of a sudden it was like, wow, I actually have a lot to say because the writer put a lot of thought into this, into
Right.
creating the world. And sometimes those details are ways that you can learn things in different disciplines.
Yeah.
And I think that makes a boring, my coworker is probably going to hear this and say Gatsby is boring, but I'm serious. It really is if you don't read it the right way. It's boring
I didn't
to,
say that. You said it, Eric.
oh, and I've said it before in faculty meetings, I don't care. But the truth is, if you're not reading it the right way,
Right.
it's like what I did when I got out of high school. I kept all my books from the English classes that I never
Mhm.
went to.
Mhm.
And when I changed my major to English, I went back and reread them. Like, what did I miss? But
Right.
if you do have those lenses, like
Yeah.
I just wanted to defenestrate them, just throw them across the room and say, what was the point of To Kill a Mockingbird? Like, of course we know that racism is
Yeah.
bad, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? But without the perspective, it doesn't become so meaningful and so powerful.
One
And
of
I
the things, sorry, go ahead.
no, I think to be able to give students that perspective
Mhm.
and let them start to explore it is
Right.
incredibly powerful. And that's what I want.
The interesting thing, because I'm listening to you as someone involved in education, but also someone who really is passionate about writing. And that I honestly, it's weird. I've written several books, but it's very hard for me to say I'm an author, even though I've written probably 2,000 plus blog posts over the years. I've written 5 books with another one coming out. And the thing that, the reason why I struggle with the idea of that I'm an author is because I use it so much for learning and understanding perspectives. And when you write a blog post, for me, knowing that anyone in the world can read it, I
Hmm.
always do what I call a 360-degree view of whatever I'm writing. What's going to be the pushback on this? And I'm trying to like get my perspective into other people's viewpoints so that
Uh-huh.
so I don't get an argument in the comments. I've addressed it before it comes up, if that makes sense. And I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate about writing, especially
Hmm.
to an audience. Like, what is going to be the pushback? Like, try to address these things before they happen and trying to understand different perspectives. And like in the innovator's mindset, the number one characteristic I share is being empathetic, and that's really understanding different perspectives and things like that too. You did mention this book, and I've never heard about it until today. And you did kind of mention prior to us recording that it kind of helped influence a little bit of some of the work that you're doing. It's called The Disengaged Teen, Helping Kids Learn Better, Feel Better, and Live Better. It's by Jenny Anderson and Rebecca Winthrop. Can you
Hmm.
tell us a little bit about that book and like how it's like maybe shape some of your views on some of the stuff that you're maybe doing in the classroom and why?
Yeah. That book is really good, by the way. I'll recommend it to any educator. It creates a taxonomy for teachers to view students
Mhm.
through. So it gives you an achiever, a passenger, a resistor, and of course I'm going to space the last one. Anyway, it's a really good taxonomy. I'm totally spacing.
Right,
Nervous.
right, right.
Uh, but it was really interesting. Like the top of it for engagement is the explorer. You've
Right.
got people who just the achievers are the ones who I'm going to jump through any hoop you give me. You give me a worksheet, I'm going to fill it out. I'm going to do anything you want, and they're not really thinking for themselves. The passengers are similar. They're going to do the bare minimum, but they just want to skate by. The explorer is somebody who's like, I'm intellectually curious and I'm really going to go out on a limb. And the one that I identified with as a high school student was somebody who was a resistor.
Mhm.
I had very little autonomy outside of school. So when I got to school, there's a little bit of wiggle room there. It was more useful for me to skip class and exert my autonomy and go think or whatever with my friends than it was to actually say, oh, I'm going to do the same thing, jump through the hoop, jump through the hoop, jump through the hoop. And I think that's one of the things that educators, especially at the high school level, if we're traditionalists, we tend to do that. Like here's something to do, here's something to do. And it doesn't give the students the right and the autonomy to say, hey, this is where I want to take this. And my learning is okay to be intellectually curious. I'm not going to have to like meet exactly the expectation that you want. I'm going to go and solve a problem or whatever.
It's interesting because you name these four things from the attack. I think you got three or four of them right away.
Yeah,
If
I
you
got all
ask
four,
me,
but yeah.
if you ask me the five pillars of my own book, I can't remember. And I'm like, that's pretty impressive. So I actually pulled it up, and so it's resistor, passenger, achiever, and explorer. And just to kind of, because I've never read this book, and I like just pulled this on a website just to kind of look up what you had mentioned. Is it like a spectrum of places, or is it like you can be anywhere? You're like, are you trying to get to the explorer stage? Like, what is it? What in that book? What do they talk about?
They do talk about like they define what the different kinds of learners look like, and they
Yeah,
do talk about how it is a spectrum and it is a fluid spectrum. You could
right.
be an explorer in one subject, and you could be, just a passenger in another subject.
Yeah,
I think as an educator, what I really want is students to be in charge of their own learning and to
yeah,
be intellectually curious. And I think anytime you can give somebody who isn't thinking or somebody who is actively resisting
yeah,
because they want to exert their own autonomy or whatever, if you can give them the steering wheel and say, hey, this is a car, try to drive it,
yeah.
they get more excited. One of the examples that I have for my own teaching is when I was teaching To Kill a Mockingbird, I was looking for primary sources for critical rights, or no, excuse me, civil rights movement here in our town of Brunswick.
Hmm.
And our librarian, who is fantastic, came up with all kinds of stuff. Martin Luther King actually spoke at one of the churches, and
Oh
there's a
wow.
recording of it. So all kinds of cool stuff. And I remember one of the kids coming in as they were like, the assignment was create a podcast about your journey, um, going over these primary sources. And this one student who was really not very engaged for almost the entire year said, hey, you know what, Mr. Bosarge, I'm like low key excited for this assignment because like I get to go and like she literally said,
Wow.
I'm kind of excited because they were in charge.
Right.
They didn't know exactly how they were going to solve it. And that's the kind of learning that I want students to have because then they can show up and say, oh, wow, this is something that I get to do. I'm in control.
Yeah, and that actually like was one of the which is obviously probably why we connected so well right away. One of my big tenets is that you want students to walk out of school knowing they can find their own pathway forward, but that means you have to give them ownership in school. It's not like you have no ownership, and now you're on your own, right?
Exactly.
It's
Yes.
that process. So, okay, so anyone that's listening, this idea of critical lens learning, no matter where you teach, if you were to give like one place to start, because everyone's going to say like, well, what's one way I can start with this? Like, what's one way I can start with this, no matter what I teach, where I'm at? What's like one piece of advice that you would have for people to kind of move along on the spectrum of what you're doing, which is, as you said, and I appreciate this because you're looking at really from the perspective of not only a teacher but a learner, right? You're still developing this. It's like interesting because you are literally on that spectrum of the explorer, right? Like you're kind of going through that process yourself, as a learner. So if I'm listening to this, what's one place I can start to just kind of get the wheels in motion of what you're currently doing in your classroom?
Okay, so I'm not going to talk about the English department stuff, but if you're in a different discipline,
Yeah.
one of the ways that you would start doing this is start to think like where do professionals in the real world in the greater community that you live in, where do they use the skills in your discipline
Mm.
and where do they apply them? I'm I'm running a professional learning group at my school. We just started, but it's called the community classroom. And one of the things we're trying to do is bring professionals in and kind of pick their brains and say, hey, what are the different critical lenses that you look at problems through? After you left the same day, I actually talked to my superintendent, Mr. Dr. Potenziano, and we talked about how even superintendents, when they have a new transfer student come into their district, they have different lenses of looking at their file, different things that they're looking for.
Right.
If you were a mechanic and you see a car that's broken down, you're going to be thinking, I'm going to look for a spark, I'm going to look for fuel, I'm looking for air. Those
Right.
are the things that you actually move a lens to look at. But within that, you also have domain specific vocabulary. You might have compression for the cylinders. And if you give students the perspectives of the professionals,
Yeah.
and then you give them the words to describe it, really what we end up at is kind of like the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, where language shapes thought,
Yeah.
and you're giving them the ability to think and see things in different ways. And if they can name what's in front of them,
Mhm.
then so these
Okay.
kind of things, it just kind of seems like it all works together. The other component that is English specific, and that's the composition piece. There are different modes of composition. And
Mhm.
I've found this to start to be really beneficial for students in different disciplines as well, because within each mode of composition, you've got narrative, definition, illustration, process analysis, comparison, and contrast. If they're acquiring new domain specific vocabulary and you say, hey, compare and contrast this one word, this one specific thing with something else, or let's use definition and let's tell me what it isn't,
Right.
or illustrate it in what it is, you're actually allowing them to see and know the world in ways that we want them to.
Right.
Like as an adult, like that's what we're going for. You can really distinguish what is what and then make meaning out of it and then decide, hey, what's the best course of action? So
Well, this is like it's interesting because I always find it fascinating to like I'm actually very curious on because we're recording this in September. I'm like interested to see like what does this look like for you, at the end of the school year, like how has it evolved? So I'm gonna give you an open invitation. I want to hear about it at the end of the year, see how it goes. Are you open for that?
that's exactly the way this would go, because I would love to do like this is how it started, this is how it ended up. These are the pitfalls. I think that would be really useful for everybody, and I'm eager to see what I learn along the journey.
Yeah, like
So
I'm eager to see like how you kind of grow through the process as well too, right? And that one thing I'll tell you this right away, Eric. Well, however it goes, I'm sure like the big thing for me is that when you're passionate about an idea is more likely to come to fruition and have success. So I can tell you're excited about this, and so that, your students are probably going to be excited about it as well. So thank you so much for taking time out of your busy school day to join me on my podcast. And so I hope other people have benefited the way I have. I appreciate your learning. Say hi to everyone in Brunswick for me.
hi everybody, Megan, Wesley, right there. Thank you so much for having me on the show. It's
Yeah.
been really nice to be able to share my ideas and my passion for education. And you spoke to so many of my coworkers, and it really inspired us too. So
I,
thank you.
I appreciate it. And listen, the next time you're back on, I promise I'll have read The Great Gatsby by then. So,
Don't do it for
no,
me.
I'm promising. I'm promising. She went out of her way. I'm going to read The Great Gatsby. So it's like a grade 11 all over again. So everyone, thanks so much for being here today. Eric, thanks so much for taking your time out of the day. Have a wonderful day. Thanks for all you do. Take care.